All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Rise Zion. My name is Seth, and I hope you're all having a very fantastic Friday. Now, today I have something absolutely fascinating to share with you about the Book of Mormon. Now, for a few years now, a popular criticism of the Book of Mormon has been circulating online, and it claims that Joseph Smith must have copied from a 19th century biblical commentary called the Adam Clarke Commentary. And Adam Clarke was a Methodist theologian, and they claim, this is the claim, they say that he used the Adam Clarke to patch together certain changes in Isaiah and other verses from the Book of Mormon, and even the inspired translation of the Bible. But a brand new study by Professor Kent P. Jackson, published by the Interpreter Foundation just a few months ago, in 2025, so this is brand new, you guys, just dropped a scholarly sledgehammer on that theory. After a full verse-by-verse analysis of every claim made by Colby Townsend, Jackson concluded, quote, "A careful analysis of the Isaiah verses in the Book of Mormon and Clarke's commentary shows that the claim is not true." This wasn't just a refutation, it was a total destruction of Colby Townsend's so-called research. And others who have tried to posit the theory, such as BYU professors Thomas A. Wayment and Haley Wilson Lemon, which is often commonly brought up in anti-Mormon subreddits, for example. While Jackson refers to Wayment and Lemon's 2020 publication as potentially a good faith effort to understand more about Joseph Smith's translation process, he didn't have many good things to say that recommend Colby Townsend's work. Townsend's article, Early 19th Century Biblical Scholarship and the Production of the Book of Mormon, tries to argue that Joseph Smith used Clarke's commentary as a secret cheat sheet for the Isaiah chapters. But Jackson takes apart that claim line by line and shows that the data simply don't support it. He calls Townsend's conclusion, quote, "the result of wishful thinking, an effort to see in the data what the author wants to see." In other words, it's not revelation that Townsend's fighting against, it's confirmation bias dressed up as scholarship. And here's where things get really ironic. In his attempt to prove the Book of Mormon a fraud, Townsend ends up bringing attention to and providing even more evidence that it's actually ancient and inspired. The very verses that he attacks turn out to reflect genuine Hebrew poetic structure. They align with ancient manuscript readings and even preserve details that match the Greek Septuagint and Dead Sea Scrolls, sources which Joseph Smith never had access to. Meanwhile, as Professor Jackson carefully pointed out, Townsend's methods reveal something deeper. It's very concerning, actually, a lack of good faith. He doesn't test his own assumptions. He just hunts for evidence to confirm them. That's not real scholarship. It's agenda-driven activism hiding under an academic label. Jackson said, quote, "Townsend's article hints that there is more involved in his study than merely a dispassionate examination of Joseph Smith's efforts to engage with biblical scholarship. I ask myself whether other scholars dispassionately looking at the same material that Townsend did could possibly have come to the same conclusions that Townsend reaches. More to the point, I do not know if others looking at the same material would even have pursued the study. There is nothing there." Okay, so he's doubting whether or not scholars would have even be bothered to look at this in the first place. And it's worth noting that Townsend's own public behavior, frequenting openly anti-Mormon YouTube channels and forums for support, only reinforces that bias that he has. When your peer reviewers are ex-Mormon Redditors, you're not pursuing truth. I have a responsibility to my audience to let them know that this is happening just in case anyone mistakenly falls for Colby Townsend as a reliable source of information. And I published this video not just for my audience, but even for the anti-Mormons out there who may be laboring under the burden of this falsehood. Interestingly, Colby Townsend's paper is not available for free online. Okay? His supporters can only access what he is selling as the truth behind a paywall of nearly $50 after tax. Sadly, this makes it very difficult for online lovers of truth to carefully examine Townsend's claims. Well, today we're going to go over just a few of the most interesting points that Townsend brings up in his paper through Professor Jackson's critique and see what all the fuss is about. You're not going to want to miss this. The truth has a funny way of surviving and coming out. Jackson's paper doesn't just expose weak scholarship, it shows divine fingerprints that can't be erased. The more critics dig into the Book of Mormon text, the more they uncover that it's not a 19th century invention. It's a text with ancient roots and a divine purpose. Let's take a step back and talk about what we actually know about Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. Not speculation, not Reddit theories, but historical evidence. Roughly 400 verses from Isaiah appear in the Book of Mormon. About half of those are identical to the King James version of the Bible, and the rest differ only slightly. We've talked about this before on the channel. That's very key. The Book of Mormon reflects the Bible Joseph Smith's generation knew, not Adam Clarke's specialized commentary. Clarke's 6-volume work was a scholarly text almost entirely absent from rural New York, and there's zero evidence Joseph Smith ever owned, borrowed, or even read it. Every witness to the translation confirms this. Emma Smith, who saw the process up close, said he had neither manuscript nor book to read from. If he had, he could not have concealed it from me. Those who observed the translation saw no Bible, no notes, no commentary, only Joseph dictating words that appeared by the gift and power of God, quote, end quote. So why does the Book of Mormon sometimes mirror the King James Version phrasing exactly? Jackson's answer is very simple but profound, and it has to do with his study. Because it was the common Bible in the English language, having the Book of Mormon's Isaiah passages match the King James translation would make sense. And it certainly made sense to the people who read the Book of Mormon during that time period and were converted by it. All of those people were deeply and intimately aware of the Bible and the King James Version of the Bible. They didn't believe that it was plagiarism, and neither should we. It made the text instantly recognizable to 19th century readers, familiar in tone, but filled with restored meaning. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. In some places where the Book of Mormon does differ from the King James Version of the Bible, those changes sometimes match ancient sources that weren't discovered until long after Joseph's time, especially the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Greek Septuagint and other early versions. Here are just a few examples. In Isaiah chapter 2, verse 16, when we compare it to 2 Nephi chapter 12, verse 16, the Book of Mormon version says, "And upon all the ships of the sea, and upon all the ships of Tarshish." Scholarship notes that the Greek Septuagint uses ships of the sea, whereas the Hebrew Masoretic text uses ships of Tarshish. The Book of Mormon includes both. And this is very interesting when we consider that it may also reflect Hebrew poetic structure that comes in groups of 3. In Isaiah chapter 3, verse 26, when we compare it to 2 Nephi chapter 13, verse 26, it says, "And she being desolate is rendered, and she shall be desolate," in the Book of Mormon text, matching the great Isaiah scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Also, in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 29, when we compare it to 2 Nephi chapter 20, verse 29, Ramoth is the name of the city in the Bible. And this is the only place, this is a very curious passage, you guys, because this is the only place that I know of where a name was changed, and it doesn't appear anywhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls at all, but it does appear in the Book of Mormon. This verse is changed to Ramah. Why does this matter? In ancient Hebrew, Ramoth has an old school ending oth. That was common in earlier times, but often dropped in later Hebrew, like in the Bible's Masoretic text, which just says Ramah. A similar thing happens in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we can see that a scribe actually corrected Ayah to Ayeth to restore that ancient ATH ending. What this means is that because the Book of Mormon uses the correct Ramoth, it signifies that the Book of Mormon was translated from an older text than the King James versions. That was translated from the Masoretic texts. These aren't random coincidences. They could be actual fingerprints of antiquity. They show that the Book of Mormon's Isaiah isn't just borrowing straight from the King James Version, it's restoring readings that match ancient manuscripts buried for over 2 millennia, and where needed in the King James Version of the Bible, adding clarity for modern English audiences. So while critics claim that Joseph Smith was copying from Adam Clarke, the evidence points in a very different direction, towards ancient sources, inspired traditions, and divine preservation. And yes, even the King James Version of the Bible. Of course, if you don't believe in miracles or translation by the gift and power of God, as Townsend likely does not, then one would need to search for some secular explanation and a source for the changes other than God, which it seems that this is what Townsend has attempted and failed to accomplish, okay? However, Professor Jackson points out that there are other secular explanations that are more simple and more likely in the light of actual scholarship for some of the translation choices that don't require Joseph Smith to have copied from Adam Clarke and don't necessarily have to do with divine inspiration. But in any case, let's dive right into this. The first example that we have is from 1 Isaiah chapter 11, verse 6. when we compare it to 2 Nephi chapter 30, verse 12. Colby Townsend pointed to the added word then in these verses. Now, please note, first of all, that this is just one word, and yet Townsend frames this possible coincidental modification as, quote, verbatim borrowing, even though there are only 4 total words involved. In addition to this, the Book of Mormon verse adds another word not found in Clarke at all, the word and, which makes it a lot less verbatim than Townsend wants you to believe. In the King James Version of the Bible, we read, "The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb," and Clarke says, "Then shall the wolf dwell with the lamb." And in 2 Nephi chapter 30, verse 12, we read, "And then shall the wolf dwell with the lamb." Now, Professor Jackson notes the Book of Mormon adds "then" to several other Isaiah verses where Clarke says nothing about it. In 1 Nephi chapter 21, verse 12, in 2 Nephi chapter 15, verse 1, 3 Nephi chapter 20, verse 32, and 3 Nephi chapter 20, verse 34. They all add the word "then" or "and then." Adam Clarke says nothing about it. Adding the temporal modifier "then" can be recognized as an observable pattern in the Book of Mormon. This happens over and over again, Professor Jackson points out. A more plausible explanation than copying from Adam Clarke, if you're looking specifically for a secular explanation as opposed to a spiritual one, is that it's a normal, commonly used English connector phrase. Okay, it's more easy to understand. If Joseph Smith wasn't getting this inspiration from the gift and power of God, then maybe he just added it because it makes sense. Okay? This is a first explanation that, as a scholar, you should default to rather than pointing to Adam Clarke as a possible explanation, especially since there are other verses of Scripture that add this same modifier where Adam Clarke says nothing about it. Okay? So this is a clear example. Instead of copying as Townsend so desperately wants to prove, maybe we should look at other possibilities first, such as the fact that people who are simply expressing themselves in English might just choose to use that word "then" to make the text make more sense. Looking through an academic lens rather than a spiritual one, Occam's razor might be duly applied here. Okay? And I think that's very important. I think that sometimes, I think that this is the clearest example of Townsend trying to make it fit, if that makes sense. But in any case, let's continue on to the next example. The next example is from Isaiah chapter 50, verse 2, when we compare it to 2 Nephi chapter 7, verse 2. In the King James Version, it says, "I dry up the sea, I make the rivers a wilderness. Their fish stinketh because there is no water, and dieth for thirst." Clarke suggests, "Their fish is dried up, in place of their fish stinketh." And in 2 Nephi chapter 7, verse 2, we read, "I dry up the sea, I make their rivers a wilderness, and their fish to stink because the waters are dried up, and they die because of thirst." Now, according to Professor Jackson, most translators and commentators today reflect the alternative reading espoused by Adam Clarke, in which he proposed changing stinketh to dried up. However, even a cursory glance at Clarke's reading of 2 Nephi chapter 7:2 does not suggest that Joseph Smith inverted the wording by reading Clarke. Okay, Townsend's claim here that the different reading in the Book of Mormon all begins with Smith trying to incorporate Clarke's dried up into the text. Jackson explains that this isn't a reasonable explanation for the verse at all. Clarke's revision and the Book of Mormon do not resemble each other at all, in the first place. In the Book of Mormon, the fish still stink, and they are not dried up, as Clarke proposes. And in Clarke, the word dried up refers to the fish, while in the Book of Mormon, it is God who dries up the waters. Also, the passage begins with God saying he would dry up the sea. This revision has no need for Adam Clarke. Interestingly, however, these verses do add some additional evidence for the Book of Mormon being translated from older versions of the book of Isaiah, which we can see the evidence for in the Septuagint, which more closely aligns with the Book of Mormon translation. These older texts use a Hebrew verb that emphasizes the stench of decay, which the Book of Mormon phrasing captures far more vividly and accurately than the King James Version. See the image on the screen for more details. The next example that we bring up is Isaiah chapter 2, verse 10, when compared to 2 Nephi chapter 12, verse 10. In the King James Version of the Bible, we read, "Enter into the rock and hide thee in the dust for fear of the Lord and for the glory of his majesty." Clarke suggests, "when he arises to strike the earth with terror." Okay, this is added at the end of the verse. And in 2 Nephi chapter 12, verse 10, we read something completely different. We read, "O ye wicked ones, enter into the rock and hide ye in the dust for the fear of the Lord and the glory of his majesty shall smite thee. Now, Colby Townsend claimed that Joseph Smith altered Isaiah chapter 2, verse 10 in the Book of Mormon after reading Adam Clarke's commentary, where Clarke adds the phrase, when he ariseth to strike the earth with terror. However, Kent P. Jackson shows this theory doesn't hold up. We can see for ourselves that the text doesn't compare at all to what Adam Clarke actually wrote. It's a huge stretch on Townsend's part to draw a connection here. The Book of Mormon's version, for the fear of the Lord and the glory of his majesty shall smite thee, shares no words, structure, or even ideas with Clarke's edition. The subject, verbs, and meanings are all completely different. Jackson explains that the Book of Mormon's variation likely arose not from Clarke's commentary, but from the awkward translation of the King James Version Bible of the text. In that version, we read, hide thee for fear of the Lord, and that's the phrase that is used. The word for is the key word here. The Book of Mormon translation may have understood it to mean because instead of for, which requires adding a clarifying clause, for he shall smite thee, right? In short, the change reflects natural English clarification, not copying from Adam Clarke. The Book of Mormon's rendering makes the verse clearer and more coherent without borrowing a single word from Clarke's commentary. In any case, let's continue. The next example that we read is from Isaiah chapter 2, verses 13 through 16. This example is especially powerful because it doesn't just show what the Book of Mormon isn't, it shows what it is. In Isaiah chapter 2, verses 13 through 16, when we compare it to 2 Nephi chapter 12, verses 13 through 16, the Book of Mormon adds a beautifully balanced couplet. We read, upon all the nations and upon every people. That's not just random filler, it's a perfect example of Hebrew parallelism. It's a poetic form that Isaiah used throughout his writings, where meanings are reinforced by repeating an idea in slightly different ways. Now, Kent P. Jackson notes that this addition fits seamlessly into the pattern of Isaiah's original Hebrew poetry, strengthening the rhythm and completing the structure. Critics like Colby Townsend claim that Joseph copied the idea from Adam Clarke's commentary, but Clarke's phrase in his book about this specific verse mentions something only about kings, princes, and republics, and they don't resemble Hebrew parallelisms at all that would be appropriate for these verses. So rather than proving dependence on Clarke, this verse does the opposite. It provides internal evidence of inspired translation. The Book of Mormon captures the authentic poetic heartbeat of ancient Hebrew scripture, something that no 19th century farm boy or even Clarke could have fabricated. The next example that we have is from Isaiah chapter 9, verse 3, when we compared it to 2 Nephi chapter 19, verse 3. The King James Version of the Bible says, Thou hast multiplied the nation and not increased the joy. Clarke notes, Thou hast multiplied the nation and increased their joy, which we read in 2 Nephi chapter 19, verse 3, Thou hast multiplied the nation and increased the joy. Here we get another example that not only dismantles the Adam Clarke theory presented by Townsend, but also strengthens the case that the Book of Mormon reflects an authentic and inspired restoration of the ancient text. The King James Version mistakenly says, and not increase the joy, because of a scribal error in the Hebrew manuscripts. And Colby seems to be intentionally misunderstanding what Clarke actually wrote. Clarke noticed this issue, but he said something completely different than what Joseph Smith put, okay? Clarke noticed this issue and preferred an alternative Hebrew reading, replacing not with to it, producing the phrase, you have increased its joy. But Kent P. Jackson points out that Joseph Smith didn't copy Clarke at all. He simply removed the erroneous not and didn't replace it with anything. He removed it from the verse without substituting any alternative phrasing. And modern scholars agree that this is the correct translation. Jackson writes of this decision, it is thus significant that the Book of Mormon does not have it. Whatever the source of that change is, in taking it out without replacing it, the Book of Mormon is clearly not following the lead of Adam Clarke. Okay, so this is actually proof against Colby Townsend's thesis here, which is very, very interesting since he had to misread what Clarke was saying in order to make this fit with his theory. That's very critical because removing not brings the verse into perfect alignment with the corrected Hebrew text, now accepted by modern biblical scholars. The Book of Mormon got it right long before biblical academics reached the same conclusion. Okay, and then Jackson adds with some bite. With all of the thousands of recommendations Clarke made for revisiting the text, and he did write a substantial amount. Okay, and so we're looking at only a few examples here, just very small, nitpicky little things. Of all of the thousands of recommendations and comments that Clarke made for revisiting and re-editing the text, Why would Joseph Smith choose such an unimportant material to draw from? None of that makes any sense. So instead of showing Joseph Smith borrowing from Clarke, this passage does the exact opposite. Again, it shows the Book of Mormon preserving an ancient, more accurate reading of Isaiah, one that was hidden in the Hebrew for centuries, one which Professor Jackson suspects was preserved in the brass plates themselves. Okay, so that is absolutely huge. Okay, so again, if this was inspired by Adam Clarke, why was Joseph Smith specifically looking at this verse, this one little comment, and then he used that as the inspiration for just removing not, when Adam Clarke actually suggests the opposite. You should actually add something there in place of not. Okay, so I think that's very significant and actually aligns perfectly with the Hebrew. In any case, let's continue reading. The next example that we have is in Isaiah chapter 48, verse 11, when we compare it to 1 Nephi chapter 20, verse 11. Here we see another example where the so-called Clarke theory collapses completely. Okay, the King James Version reads, "For how should my name be polluted?" Clarke's commentary suggests, "For how would my name be blasphemed?" And the Book of Mormon says, "For I will not suffer my name to be polluted." Okay, again, very, very different. Kent P. Jackson points out that there's no connection at all between Clarke's rewording and the Book of Mormon's version. They share no unique phrasing, no matching verbs, and no textual logic in common. What's more, the phrase "my name" isn't even in the Hebrew text. It comes from the Greek Septuagint, again, which many modern translations now accept as the correct reading. So the Book of Mormon actually reflects a legitimate ancient source, not a modern commentary on it. Okay, not the Adam Clarke. But critics like Colby Townsend are stretching for a connection anyway. He claims that because Clarke mentions that the Syriac and Vulgate translation use the phrase "that I may not be blasphemed," and because the Book of Mormon also uses the word "I," that somehow proves that Joseph Smith borrowed from Adam Clarke. Jackson responded with razor-sharp sarcasm in his paper. It is difficult to know how to respond to this kind of thought process. How can this be considered evidence at all, let alone strong evidence? In other words, the critic's logic is absurd. Sharing the word "I" isn't evidence of dependence, it's evidence of desperation. This passage adds even more weight to the growing pattern. The Book of Mormon consistently aligns with ancient textual traditions that Joseph Smith could not have known, while the critics keep seeing connections that dissolve the moment they're tested. In the end, the evidence speaks for itself. Kent P. Jackson's careful, verse-by-verse analysis reveals that Joseph Smith did not draw upon Adam Clarke, nor is it likely that he drew from other modern commentators in producing the Book of Mormon, when other more reasonable explanations exist, even secular explanations that align closer with common sense. The use of "then," for example, just being one of the more natural ways to use English of Joseph Smith's time. Just as Jackson found not a single bit of evidence that Joseph used Clarke in his inspired translation of the Bible, the same holds true for the Isaiah passages in the Book of Mormon. None of Townsend's proposed examples of borrowing can be sustained. They collapse under scrutiny, leaving behind nothing but conjecture dressed up as scholarship. As Professor Jackson powerfully points out, if Joseph Smith did obtain ideas from Adam Clarke, what would explain why he would overlook the many meaningful comments that Clarke made while fixating on only small, unimportant word changes like the ones Townsend proposes? Further, because taking ideas from Clarke cannot explain the scores of other ways Isaiah in the Book of Mormon differs from Isaiah in the Bible, why would we believe Townsend's examples? Also, if Joseph Smith had been pretending to restore plain and precious things by means of editing Isaiah, why did he turn to small word changes like these instead of passages that could be categorized as plain and precious? The explanations provided by Townsend to bolster his claim show to what lengths he was willing to go to look for evidence for his idea. I suspect that he checked every Book of Mormon Isaiah variant against Clarke's commentary, and this was the best he could do. None of his examples work. All can be explained in better ways. This is not an academic project, but rather a search for ways to justify a predetermined conclusion. It is not serious scholarship. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, that is a serious condemnation of this paper by another professor. Okay, but something more profound emerges. That is a very, very serious rebuke. That is a very, very serious rebuke of an academic work. I'm imagining right now a smoldering pile of ash. Okay, but something actually that I noticed far more profound emerges from the ashes of Townsend's failed theory. Okay, the very verses that Townsend tried to use against the Book of Mormon turned out to be some of the strongest evidence for its authenticity at the same time. The removal of the erroneous not, for example, in Isaiah chapter 9, verse 3, aligns the Book of Mormon with the corrected Hebrew manuscripts known today. The poetic couplets added in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 13 through 16 echo the rhythmic symmetry of genuine Hebrew parallelism, reflecting an awareness of ancient literary forms. And in Isaiah chapter 48, verse 11, the Book of Mormon preserves a phrasing consistent with the Greek Septuagint, an ancient witness Joseph Smith could never have accessed. Okay, each example points not backwards to a 19th century commentary, but deeper into the ancient world. The evidence suggests that what Joseph Smith translated was not the product of human ingenuity, but of divine revelation working through ancient sources preserved on the plates of brass. The Book of Mormon behaves not like a patchwork of borrowed theology or borrowed commentaries from the Adam Clarke, but like an echo of the ancient East brought forth by the Spirit of God into modern English. And this is the great irony. Townsend's efforts to discredit the Book of Mormon have instead fortified its foundation. His work, intended to vindicate skepticism, has only clarified the strength of the text's ancient character. In seeking to expose weaknesses, he has highlighted divine fingerprints. Jackson concludes that Townsend's project is not an academic inquiry, but rather a search to justify a predetermined conclusion. Yet the truth requires no such manipulation. The truth stands on its own. The Book of Mormon continues to demonstrate what Joseph Smith declared from the beginning, that it is a record of a fallen people, written by way of commandment, and that by the spirit of prophecy and revelation it came forth. Okay, the critics keep on searching for modern sources, and every time they dig, they uncover ancient ones instead. It gets more profound the deeper that you look. Now, before we end here, I just want to bear you my testimony that I know for myself that the Book of Mormon is true, not by academic research, right? Not by looking at all of these different minutiae within the text, right? These are all very, very interesting pieces of details that constitute frosting, I like to say. We have the cake. The cake is good and delicious by itself, but now we have frosting on top, right? This is just frosting that adds to the cake, and who likes to have cake without frosting, right? That's why I love these things. But the cake of it all, the real meat of all of this discussion is that I know that the Book of Mormon is true for myself. I know it because I've read it and because I've studied it through the Spirit. And I know by the Spirit that it is true. And I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Now, before you go, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Our new goal is to reach 60,000 subscribers in 3 months to spread these important messages to as many people as possible through the YouTube algorithm and to help support the cause of Zion. If you'd like, please also consider becoming a member to the channel to help our channel to keep growing and to help support our volunteers who have so diligently been working behind the scenes to make this channel a success. When you become a member, you are rewarded with some cool perks, including custom emojis and a custom name badge that goes next to your name. So make sure that you become a member. And also, we'll be doing a raffle for members only, so make sure to become a member if you haven't already. Make sure to check out our live streams every Thursday evening. We also have t-shirts available for pre-order on our website, risezion.org, and other products if you'd like to help to support the channel in other ways. But thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, bye.